On a warm afternoon at Ambetter Health 400, the conversation around American stock car racing shifted in a way few executives anticipated. The race itself was fast, aggressive, tight, but it was what happened in the closing laps and what followed in the garage that ignited something larger. Drivers publicly criticized Carson Hocevar for what they described as reckless, overly opportunistic moves in high-speed draft packs. Radio transmissions leaked, post-race interviews sharpened, veterans questioned judgment, younger drivers defended intensity, and suddenly, this wasn't just about one maneuver, it raised harder questions. Has the competitive structure of NASCAR Cup Series incentivized risk over restraint? Are rule packages creating artificial chaos? And what happens when the sport's internal code, the unwritten trust between drivers at 190 miles per hour, begins to erode? For many Americans, NASCAR is more than a sport. It is regional identity, manufacturing pride, sponsor-driven business, a multi-billion-dollar ecosystem stretching from small machine shops to Fortune 500 boardrooms. When conflict spills into public view, it reverberates beyond pit road, because trust is the currency of speed. Without it, the margins shrink. The Atlanta fallout was not a viral moment. It was a structural warning, a signal that tension inside the garage may reflect deeper pressures shaping modern American motorsport, financial, technological, cultural, and once that trust fractures, the consequences rarely stay confined to one racetrack. To understand Atlanta 2026, we need to rewind. For decades, NASCAR operated on a delicate balance: mechanical ingenuity, driver skill, team loyalty. But over time, financial pressures intensified. Television rights became central revenue engines. Corporate sponsorship evolved from logo placement to data-driven marketing partnerships. Margins narrowed. Expectations grew. The introduction of the next-gen car in the early 2020s was meant to control costs and modernize competition. Standardized parts, centralized suppliers, a chassis designed to equalize the field. It worked in one sense. Parity increased. Smaller teams could compete more consistently, but parity also compresses space. At superspeedways like Atlanta Motor Speedway, aerodynamic packages and high-grip surfaces create dense draft packs. Cars run inches apart at extreme speed. One miscalculation can trigger a chain reaction. Historically, NASCAR has walked this line before. The restrictor plate era at Daytona International Speedway and Talladega Superspeedway produced similar debates. Exciting racing, spectacular finishes, and sometimes devastating crashes. What's different now is the business environment. Teams operate under tighter financial constraints. Sponsors demand visibility. Social media amplifies conflict instantly. Drivers build personal brands independent of teams. Every incident becomes content. Atlanta wasn't an isolated flare-up. It was the product of years of structural change. A sport reshaped by cost control, digital exposure, and competitive compression. In that environment, aggression isn't accidental. It's incentivized. And when incentives shift, behavior follows. At its core, the Atlanta fallout revolves around three interlocking forces. First, aerodynamic dependency. The next-gen platform emphasizes drafting efficiency. Cars punch smaller holes in the air alone, but become faster in tight packs. This rewards bold lane changes, split-second decisions, calculated risks that were once avoided. Second, economic pressure. Teams rely heavily on sponsor exposure metrics. Running mid-pack quietly does little for brand visibility. Leading laps, even briefly, translates into camera time, social engagement, measurable return. Drivers understand this. Aggression becomes strategy, not emotion. Third, generational shift. Veteran drivers built reputations in eras where mechanical differences created natural separation. Today's younger cohort grew up in hyper-competitive development pipelines, simulator-trained, data-optimized, conditioned to attack small openings. When Carson Hocevar made aggressive blocks and lane moves in Atlanta's closing laps, critics framed it as immaturity. Supporters saw competitive instinct, but the deeper mechanism wasn't personality, it was structure. Tightly packed cars, standardized equipment, sponsor-driven urgency, algorithm-amplified controversy. In that environment, the margin between assertive and reckless narrows dramatically. The problem is not one driver. It is the feedback loop. Risk yields attention. Attention fuels brand equity. Brand equity sustains funding until a crash forces recalibration, and that loop is difficult to unwind once embedded. When trust frays inside the garage, the ripple effects move outward quickly. Teams reassess alliances. Manufacturers recalibrate strategy. Sponsors evaluate reputational exposure. Broadcast partners weigh narrative framing. NASCAR leadership faces pressure to respond without appearing reactionary. One disruption triggers others. Consider a recent historical parallel. The 2015 incident between Joey Logano and Matt Kenseth escalated from on-track contact to intentional retaliation weeks later. The league intervened. Suspensions followed. The sport absorbed reputational strain. Sponsors faced uncomfortable headlines. What that episode revealed was systemic fragility. When competitive grievances linger, they influence racing behavior long after the checkered flag. Drivers hesitate in drafting lines. Alliances shift unpredictably. Fans polarize. Atlanta 2026 carries similar risk. If multiple drivers publicly question another's judgment, cooperation at superspeedways weakens. Drafting requires mutual assurance. Without it, instability rises. Instability increases crash probability. Crashes affect point standings, playoff dynamics, financial payouts. The system is interdependent. Economics feeds behavior. Behavior shapes safety. Safety influences public trust. Public trust drives ratings and sponsorship. In a tightly coupled environment, small strategic misalignments amplify quickly. That is the hidden lesson of Atlanta. Much of the initial coverage framed the fallout as personality conflict. Young driver versus veterans. Old school versus new school. Emotion versus discipline. It is an appealing storyline. Simple, relatable, clickable, but it misses the structural forces beneath. Mainstream sports commentary often isolates incidents from incentives. A block becomes arrogance. A shove becomes temper. Yet rarely does the conversation extend to aerodynamic rule sets, cost control frameworks, or sponsor activation metrics. Emotional framing distorts analysis. The reality is less dramatic and more systemic. NASCAR engineered parity to reduce costs and increase unpredictability. That unpredictability enhances entertainment value. But it also compresses space at speed. When coverage centers solely on Hocevar's intent, it obscures how design decisions shape behavior. Drivers operate within engineered constraints. They respond to incentives. This does not absolve accountability. Judgment matters. Experience matters. But structural context matters more. Oversimplification fuels polarization. Fans align with personalities instead of examining policy. Executives respond to noise instead of metrics. Strategic reality demands wider lens analysis. Because without it, reforms address symptoms, not causes. Looking ahead, 3 plausible trajectories emerge. First, regulatory recalibration. NASCAR may adjust aerodynamic packages at drafting tracks. Subtle changes to spoiler configuration or engine mapping could widen separation slightly, reducing pack density without eliminating excitement. Second, financial restructuring. Revenue distribution models may evolve to reduce sponsor dependency on short-term exposure metrics. If teams feel less pressure for constant visibility, aggression could moderate naturally. Third, technological acceleration. Simulation tools, AI-driven race analytics, and driver monitoring systems will expand. Real-time risk assessment could influence race control decisions. Data transparency may increase accountability, but uncertainty remains. Climate volatility affects scheduling. Media consumption patterns continue shifting toward digital fragmentation. Younger audiences engage differently than traditional fan bases. If trust inside the garage deteriorates further, the league risks reputational erosion. Not dramatic collapse, gradual decline. Conversely, if leadership integrates structural reform with cultural dialogue, Atlanta could become inflection point rather than fracture. The next decade will test NASCAR's adaptability, not in horsepower, in governance. For American households, this may seem distant, a racing controversy, internal politics, but NASCAR reflects broader economic themes: cost containment, standardization, media monetization, brand-driven performance pressure. These dynamics shape industries far beyond motorsport. When you watch conflict unfold on track, consider underlying incentives. Who benefits from risk? Who absorbs downside? How do rule changes alter behavior? In everyday life, similar patterns appear. In financial markets, reacting to quarterly earnings pressure. In tech platforms, optimizing engagement over stability. In politics, shaped by short news cycles. For viewers, the key indicators to monitor are structural. Rule adjustments at drafting tracks. sponsor diversification trends, broadcast contract negotiations, driver development pathways. These signals reveal direction more than post-race quotes. If you value long-term systems-level analysis, follow these inflection points. They matter more than momentary outrage. And if this perspective helps clarify the bigger picture, consider subscribing, not for headlines, for context, because context endures. Atlanta 2026 is not just about one driver or one race. It is a case study in how tightly interconnected systems behave under pressure. Engineering influences economics. Economics shapes incentives. Incentives guide human decision-making. Human decisions ripple across institutions. That pattern applies globally, from energy markets to supply chains, from financial systems to digital media ecosystems. Small structural tweaks can yield disproportionate consequences. Motorsport simply compresses the timeline. At 190 miles per hour, feedback loops accelerate. Errors manifest instantly, but the underlying lesson is universal. Modern systems are optimized for efficiency. Efficiency reduces slack. Reduced slack magnifies risk. As observers, we have a choice. Consume conflict at surface level, or step back and examine architecture. When we understand architecture, we see patterns earlier. We interpret headlines differently. We resist emotional oversimplification. Atlanta becomes more than controversy, it becomes lens. And in an interconnected world, clarity is not just informative, it is stabilizing.